The wind swept across the bare Nevada desert like a forgotten memory, dry and indifferent. Beneath the scorched horizon, a frail Mustang foal staggered over a patch of cracked earth. His coat, once meant to be a soft dun, was patchy with mange and dust. Flies clung to the crusted corners of his eyes. His ribs jutted out like the bones of an old fence. Every step trembled under the weight of weakness. He paused, tilted his narrow head upward, and let out a sound, sharp, thin, and desperate. A cry for help. It carried over the plain, like a ghost with nowhere to rest. But there was no answer. Around him, silence reigned. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that follows tragedy, raw and echoing. A single vulture circled above, its shadow crawling along the sand. The foal took another step forward, then collapsed onto his knees. His legs folded under him like twigs. He lay there, sides heaving, ears twitching at phantom noises. He cried again, a small, quivering whinny that cracked halfway through. Somewhere deep in his young bones, he seemed to understand. No one was coming. He remembered the stampede, the thunder of hooves as the herd fled, his mother darting left, shielding him from a mountain lion's lunge. She'd reared up, kicked, fought like the wild queen she was. But blood poured from her side, fast and final. She'd nudged him once more with her muzzle before crumpling into the dust. He had stayed beside her, nudging her neck, waiting for her breath to return. It never did. And when he looked up, the herd had vanished beyond the ridge, leaving him with the stillness. That had been 2 days ago. Or maybe 3. Time blurred when you were starving. Miles away, past a ragged fence and a rusted sign that once read private land, an old man sat alone in a lawn chair with its back legs sinking into dirt. Gus Holloway squinted at the horizon. He nursed a mug of bitter coffee and swirled it absently. The trailer behind him was weather-worn, its roof patched with tin, its paint long flaked away. A dog bowl sat empty by the door. No dog, no noise, just the hum of flies and the occasional groan of the wind. Gus reached for his radio, but didn't turn it on. He rarely did anymore. Most days, he just sat. He had grown into silence like an old coat, something he neither liked nor hated, just accepted. He'd buried too many things, his wife, his horse, his future, and now he lived as though no one expected anything else from him. A sound stirred the air, distant, faint, unnatural. Gus tilted his head. Another cry. Long, weak. He waited. It came again. Coyotes, maybe. Or a calf stuck in wire. But something about the pitch. It cut different. Less wild, more pleading. He set down the mug. Against his better judgment, he stood up, groaning as his knees cracked. He grabbed his hat from the porch rail, slapped it onto his head, and stepped into the sun. There was always something pulling broken things toward him. He didn't know why. The crying grew louder as he approached the edge of the gully that sliced through his property. A narrow ribbon of green ran along its bottom, rare shade, a few tough weeds, and cooler ground. He stopped short. There, tangled among the sagebrush, lay the foal. Gus didn't speak right away. He took in the scene. Legs too thin to support much, hips sunken deep, a belly swollen not from food but gas and weakness. The animal blinked slowly. Its gaze met his, not wild, not tame, just utterly lost. The kind of look you find in war survivors and abandoned children. Gus had seen both. Damn, he muttered, squatting beside it. He reached out carefully. The foal didn't move. Not even a flinch. That worried him more than if it had bitten. You got a name? Gus asked, voice low and dry. Didn't think so. His fingers brushed the foal's neck. Fever. The animal was burning up. Infection, maybe. Or worse. And it had no business still being alive. Gus stood, rubbed his chin. Logic said leave it. Let nature handle it. That's what the wild did. That's what people had told him too. When his wife got sick, when his horse panicked during the fire, when the world turned its back on him. Things die. Things leave. Let him. But the foal whimpered again. Just a sound. But it slipped past his defenses like a knife through canvas. All right, he grunted. Fine. Back at the trailer. He pulled an old horse blanket from the shed. Then an even older wheelbarrow. The wheel squealed as he pushed it downhill. It took almost an hour to maneuver the foal into it. Sweat on his brow, curses in the air, the foal barely conscious. He talked the whole time, softly. Not because the foal understood, but because Gus hadn't spoken that much in months. Once loaded, he pushed it uphill, straining every step. At the trailer, he lowered the foal onto the patch of shade beneath the awning and fetched water from the tank. The foal barely swallowed, but its lips moved. Gus wrapped a blanket around it, brought out iodine, an old bucket, and a sponge. The wounds were cleaned slowly, each one making the foal jerk weakly. Gus didn't stop. He'd stitched worse, bandaged worse, buried worse. That night, he laid on the porch with his back against the post and watched the stars emerge. The foal slept fitfully nearby, hooves twitching in some dream. He didn't know why he'd done it. Didn't know why his chest felt full in a way it hadn't in years. Maybe it was the way the foal hadn't looked away. Maybe it was because the foal hadn't run. Or maybe it was just easier to care for something else than to keep nursing the emptiness inside himself. He closed his eyes, whispered without thinking, "You better not die, little one." From the shadows, a single star fell across the sky, and from the darkness beside him, the foal let out one last sound, softer now, less frightened, as if for the first time. It wasn't calling for help. It was simply letting someone know it was still there. Gus didn't say anything. He just sat there, listening. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely alone. The morning sun crept over the ridge, casting long shadows across the yard. The foal lay motionless on the patch of dirt beneath the awning, cocooned in the old horse blanket Gus had wrapped around him. A light breeze ruffled the blanket's edge, exposing the scabbed-over wound on his flank. Gus emerged from the trailer with a chipped tin bowl filled with warm water and oats softened overnight. He set it down near the foal and crouched beside him, watching closely. "Try again," he muttered. "Ain't got all day." The foal shifted. One ear flicked lazily, and his head turned toward the bowl. For the first time in 2 days, he leaned forward. His lips brushed the surface of the mash, and he took a hesitant bite. Gus felt a knot in his chest ease, though he didn't show it. He exhaled through his nose and leaned back on his boots. "That's more like it." The foal, whom Gus had started calling Dusty, though he'd never said it out loud, was still dangerously thin. But the spark behind those tired eyes had grown brighter since he'd been brought in. Each hour he survived was another Gus hadn't expected him to. Later that afternoon, Gus sat on the porch with his toolbox, repairing a broken latch on the gate. The sun was high, and the heat pressed down on everything like a heavy hand. A car pulled up, a dented blue pickup. Gus didn't look up until he heard the door slam. "Figured I'd find you hiding out here," said a voice. Mara. She walked up the path with a wide-brimmed hat and a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. Her boots crunched on the gravel. She glanced at Dusty and stopped in her tracks. "What the hell, Gus?" He didn't look up from his latch. Heard a cry. Went to look. Found him. She approached the foal slowly, kneeling beside him. "He's worse off than anything I've seen this season." She lifted his foreleg gently and examined the cracked hoof. "He shouldn't be alive." "Well, he is," Gus replied flatly. "And you're taking care of him?" Her tone was disbelieving, but not unkind. "Last time I brought you astray, you told me take it straight to hell." Gus gave a one-shouldered shrug. "This one found me." Mara reached into her bag and pulled out a small bottle of powdered antibiotics. "You'll need this. And some real feed. That slurry you're giving him won't hold for long." Gus took the bottle, studied the label like it was written in a foreign language, then nodded. "Thanks." She squinted at him. "What's going on with you, Gus?" "Nothing," he said too quickly. She didn't push, just walked back to her truck. Before she left, she looked back and said, "You're not the only one who's been alone too long." The trailer door creaked open again that evening. Gus stepped out carrying an old saddle blanket and a dented bucket of warm water. Dusty was standing. It wasn't graceful, more like a newborn deer wobbling on stilts, but he was up. His legs trembled, and his chest heaved from the effort, but he held his ground. "Well, I'll be damned," Gus whispered. He set the bucket down and walked over slowly. Dusty's ears twitched at his approach, but he didn't flinch. That was new. The horse didn't trust him, not yet, but he no longer recoiled from every shadow. Gus reached out, and this time, Dusty let his fingers rest on his neck. He felt the pulse beneath the skin, fast and strong, alive. "You got something in you, don't you?" Gus murmured. Inside the trailer that night, Gus sat at the table with a glass of cheap bourbon. The light above flickered faintly. Across the table, a photo sat in a cracked frame. It was old, sun-bleached. A woman with long hair stood beside a tall bay horse, smiling. Her hand rested on the animal's neck like she'd grown up with him. Gus had taken that picture the day they'd moved to this land. The woman was his wife, Clara. The horse was Ranger. He took a sip, closed his eyes. The barn fire had happened in seconds. One moment the thunderstorm rolled in, and the next, lightning struck the roof. The timbers caught like tinder. Gus had rushed in, first to save Clara, then Ranger. He got Clara out, but when he turned to go back in, Ranger had panicked, kicking wildly. Gus called, shouted, pleaded, but the stallion wouldn't come. Smoke poured through the doors. Ranger bolted in the wrong direction, broke through a wall, and ran into the night. They found him the next morning by the creek, burned, shaking, covered in ash. Gus had never told anyone the worst part. He'd put Ranger down himself. Couldn't bear to let anyone else do it. He hadn't ridden since. Hadn't spoken to a horse since. Until Dusty. A noise outside broke his thoughts. He stepped onto the porch. Dusty stood under the starlight, wobbling gently as he took slow steps around the enclosure. Gus watched him for a while. By the third week, Dusty could walk without stumbling. The mange had receded. His coat, though still patchy, had a faint shine. His wounds had scabbed and were beginning to scar over. Every day, Gus would feed him, clean the shelter, sit with him. He started talking again. Small things, grumbles about the weather, comments about the radio, half-told stories he hadn't said aloud in years. Dusty listened, or at least stood still while Gus spoke. That was enough. Sometimes, when the sun began to set and the air cooled just right, Dusty would trot, clumsy, but determined. The first time he did it, Gus had chuckled. Not laughed, not quite, but something close. Mara came back one morning and leaned against the gate, arms crossed. "You're changing," she said. "Don't be ridiculous." Gus grumbled. She nodded toward Dusty. "He's getting strong. He's going to need space. Real land. Got enough here." She hesitated, then added, "The Bureau's moving herds again, rounding them up for management. Wild foals are being culled." Gus narrowed his eyes. "He's not wild anymore. They won't care." He didn't say anything, just stared at the horizon. That night, Gus stood in the doorway and watched Dusty sleep. The young horse breathed steadily, chest rising and falling like waves. He looked peaceful and vulnerable, like something still caught between two worlds, wild and tame, broken and whole. Gus whispered, more to himself than anyone, "Ain't nobody taking you from here." And from the quiet darkness, Dusty stirred, his ears flicking toward the sound of that promise. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the scent of gasoline and dust. Gus stood by the corral, watching Dusty circle the fence line, alert and unsettled. His movements were smoother now, more balanced, his limbs stronger, but his posture was tight, ears flicking back and forth. Something had unsettled him, and Gus felt it too. A presence, invisible but heavy. It wasn't long before the truck appeared. A long, black pickup with out-of-state plates and a dull chrome grille that caught the morning light like a blade. It crept down the old dirt road, slow and deliberate. Gus didn't move from his spot. His eyes narrowed as the truck rolled to a stop, just outside the fence. Two men stepped out, both wearing jeans too clean for ranch work and boots that hadn't seen a day of dirt. "You Gus Holloway?" the taller one asked, pushing his sunglasses up his nose. "Depends who's the skin," Gus replied flatly. "We're with Land Watch Holdings. Heard you got a foal on your property. One that ain't registered." Dusty snorted, sensing the tension. He backed away from the fence. Gus folded his arms. "That's so. And what's it to you?" "We're contracting for BLM," the second man said, flipping open a clipboard. "Every unregistered Mustang in this area is being rounded up. It's for management and safety." Got an order right here. Management, Gus echoed, spitting into the dirt. Right. You mean hauling them off to rot in holding pens or worse? The taller man stepped forward. This ain't personal, sir. We'll be quick. You touch that foal, Gus said, voice low and even. You'll regret it. They exchanged a glance, smirking. One moved toward the gate, reaching for the latch. Before his hand touched the metal, a loud crack rang out. Gus had fired his shotgun into the air, not aiming to hit, but to halt. Dusty bolted back into the shelter, heart pounding. The men froze, then slowly backed off. I don't aim to shoot men, Gus said, lowering the gun. But I'll protect what's mine. They didn't argue, just muttered something about calling a ranger and retreated to the truck. The engine roared as they peeled off down the road, leaving a cloud of dust behind them. That night, Mara arrived with hay and feed, but Gus wasn't himself. He barely looked at her as he unloaded the supplies. They came for him, he said finally. Some big company with paperwork and a badge. Mara's face darkened. They're everywhere. It's a sweep. They don't care if he's tame. If he doesn't have papers, he's just a number. Not to me, Gus said. She stepped closer. You know they'll come back. And next time they won't just bring words. He nodded slowly. Then, as if the thought had already formed in his bones, he said, I've got to prepare him. He has to be ready. If I can prove he's trained, rideable, they might back off. Mara hesitated. Gus, you haven't ridden since. I know, he said, cutting her off. But I'm not letting them take him. The days that followed were harder than any Gus had known in years. Every morning before dawn, he stepped into the corral and faced Dusty like he was seeing him for the first time. He started small, getting the halter on, leading him in circles, touching his legs, his back, brushing him down with practiced hands. Dusty, once cautious and flighty, now responded with a quiet intelligence. He watched Gus with wide, curious eyes, his ears tuned to every sound. But the saddle was different. The first time Gus brought it out, Dusty froze. He sniffed it, then jerked his head away. The scent was unfamiliar, layered with sweat and old leather. Gus didn't rush. He let the saddle sit on the fence for hours. Then the next day, he lifted it gently and placed it on Dusty's back. The young Mustang flinched, but didn't bolt. Progress was slow, measured in inches, in seconds of calm. Some days were worse. Dusty would rear or kick, panic flashing across his face. Gus would whisper to him, kneel beside him, wait for the storm to pass. And each time, the storm took less time to settle. On the 12th day, Gus climbed into the saddle. His heart pounded like a drum. The last time he'd done this, the world had turned to smoke. But Dusty stood steady, his muscles twitching beneath Gus's weight, waiting. And then, with a soft nudge of the reins, they moved. It wasn't fast. It wasn't graceful. But it was a beginning. They practiced daily, walking, turning, stopping. Dusty responded with growing confidence. Mara came by often, sometimes watching from the fence, sometimes helping adjust tack or clear brush from the path. One evening, she brought a camera. I want to document this, she said. If we can show how far he's come, they can't ignore it. Gus didn't argue. He let her film their rides, short loops around the property, Dusty's steps light and precise. With every ride, Gus felt something loosen in his chest. The guilt that had lived inside him for years, dark and coiled, began to ease. One morning, he opened the old tack trunk and pulled out Ranger's bridle. It was cracked but clean. He stood holding it for a long time. Then he brought it to Dusty. The Mustang sniffed it, then lowered his head. Gus slipped it on with hands that didn't shake. You're not him, Gus whispered. But you're something else. Something new. And Dusty stood taller. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Gus and Dusty stood side by side at the top of the ridge. The sky was blood orange, and the wind had gone still. Gus looked out over the land, then down at the foal, who was no longer quite a foal. You're ready, he said. And somewhere deep inside, he hoped he was too. The morning the officials returned, the sky was overcast, and the air hung thick with the kind of stillness that always came before something important. Gus stood at the gate with his hat low over his brow, Dusty beside him, tact and calm, as if he sensed what this moment meant. The Mustang's coat had shed its sickly dullness, replaced by a soft, gleaming sheen. His eyes were clearer now, wiser. He wasn't a rescued foal anymore. He was a survivor, and he carried that weight with quiet pride. The black truck came into view just as the sun broke through the clouds. 2 new agents this time, clean-cut, clipboard ready. They parked without a word and stepped out with neutral expressions. But as soon as their eyes met Dusty's, something flickered, recognition maybe, or surprise. "You the man who filed the exemption request?" one of them asked. Gus nodded. "That's right." He handed over a folder, documentation Mara had helped him compile. Photos, training logs, veterinary records, even a notarized statement verifying Dusty's training status and place of origin. The man flipped through it slowly, lips tight. Then he looked up. "You trained him yourself?" Gus patted Dusty's neck. "He did most of the work. I just showed up." The second man circled Dusty cautiously. "He's calm," he murmured, almost grudgingly. "I didn't raise a wild animal," Gus said. "I raised a partner." The man returned to the clipboard, sighed, and said, "We'll file this. He stays for now." "For good," Gus replied. "You just don't know it yet." When the truck rolled away, Gus didn't move. Dusty leaned into him slightly, his breath warm against Gus's shoulder. They watched until the vehicle disappeared down the winding road. And even then, neither of them turned away from the horizon for a long time. That evening, Mara brought visitors. A boy, maybe 15, with nervous eyes and a slight limp, stepped out of her truck, arms folded tightly around his chest. She introduced him as Eli, a foster kid sent to Mara's after a string of bad placements. Gus didn't ask questions. He just nodded toward the barn. "Pitch in if you want to," he said. Eli said nothing, but followed. The work started small, carrying hay, cleaning troughs, watching from a distance as Gus moved around Dusty. At first, he avoided the horse entirely, always standing just outside the fence line, always gripping something tight in his fists. But Dusty, as if recognizing something quiet and broken in the boy, began to inch closer. One afternoon, Gus caught Eli sitting by the corral, legs crossed, talking softly. Dusty stood nearby, ears turned forward, as still as stone. Gus didn't interrupt. Later, Gus brought out Ranger's old saddle, freshly oiled, the leather repaired where it had cracked from disuse. He laid it over the rail, ran a hand across its edge. "Used to belong to the best horse I ever knew," he said without looking up. "But he spooked when it mattered. I blamed him. Then I blamed myself. Took me too long to forgive either." Eli stood beside him silently. "You ever lose something like that?" Gus asked. Eli's jaw tightened. "Everyone I ever trusted." Gus nodded once. "Yeah, that'll do it." The next morning, Eli helped tag Dusty without being asked. When Gus lifted the saddle, Eli stepped in to steady it. Their hands touched briefly, awkward, unsure, and then moved apart. But the gesture held weight. Weeks passed. Dusty grew stronger. His trot became a canter, his turns sharper, his stops crisp. Gus rode him daily, with Eli watching, asking questions, helping where he could. One afternoon, Gus motioned to the saddle and said, "Your turn." Eli froze. "I've never." "I know. That's the point." It took a full 5 minutes for Eli to mount. Dusty stood perfectly still, waiting. When the boy finally settled in the saddle, Gus stood close, guiding his hand to the reins. "Just breathe," he said. "You're not riding fear. You're riding through it." The ride was short, just a circle around the inner paddock, but when Eli dismounted, there were tears in his eyes. "I didn't think I could," he whispered. "You didn't have to," Gus said. "You just had to try." Word of Dusty's recovery spread. Mara posted a video of Gus and Eli riding together, 2 shadows cutting across the golden hills under a rose-colored sky. People started calling. Donations arrived in the mail. One envelope came with only 3 words scribbled inside. Asterisk, he made it. Asterisk. With Mara's help, Gus filed paperwork to open a sanctuary. They called it Dusty's Refuge. It started with one small barn and a lot of borrowed equipment. Within months, There were 5 rescued foals, 2 abandoned quarter horses, and a skinny old mule with one ear missing. Gus taught Eli how to read a horse's eyes, how to treat an abscess, how to wrap a sprain. But more than that, he taught him how to be still, how to listen. And Eli, in turn, reminded Gus what it meant to believe again. One clear morning, Gus rode Dusty up to the same ridge where it had all started. The land stretched endlessly before them, golden grasses swaying in waves, the fences barely visible. Dusty shifted beneath him, calm, strong, and full of life. Gus took off his hat, let the breeze touch his face. "I thought I was done," he said softly. "Thought the best of me died with her. But you brought something back I thought was gone forever." Dusty turned his head slightly, as if listening. Gus slid off and stood beside him, hand on the horse's shoulder. "You saved me, boy." That night, Gus sat on the porch, the stars bright overhead. Eli leaned against the post beside him, Dusty grazing nearby in the moonlight. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Eli asked. "Used to," Gus replied. "Now I just think about what it needs next." They sat in silence a long time. Then Gus added, "You got a place here, if you want it." Eli looked out across the pasture, where the wind carried laughter from the new volunteers and the low whinnies of horses settling in for the night. "I do," he said, and Gus nodded, like he'd known that answer before the boy had spoken it. Somewhere in the dark, Dusty raised his head and whinnied, not a cry, not a warning, but something else entirely. A call, maybe, or a thank you. And Gus, for the first time in decades, allowed himself to believe that everything broken could still be made whole. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing. I bring true, heartfelt stories every day.